wind of the old American West carried many names. Some were famous, some were feared, and a few were simply forgotten. But among them all, one man stood apart. John Bull, an Englishman who crossed the ocean, entered the lawless heart of America, and somehow lived to tell the tale. He was shot more than once. He lost an arm. He carried a bullet in his neck for 50 years. And still he didn't die. This is his story. The story of the gunman who wouldn't die. John Bull was born around 1836, far from the dust and saloons of the Wild West. He came from England, a country of rain, cobblestone streets, and order. The exact opposite of what his life would become. No one knows much about his early years. No family records, no real hometown. It's as if he was born to disappear. In his early 20s, John Bull left England. He set sail for America, the land of gold, freedom, and danger. It was the 1850s, the world of cowboys, prospectors, and drifters. A man could make his fortune or lose his life in a single hand of cards. And for Bull, that gamble was everything. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was something in between, a survivor. The first time people heard his name was in Montana Territory, around 1862. It was a rough mining camp at Gold Creek. Men lived fast and fought faster. There were no sheriffs, no laws, only guns and guts. One night, John Bull and a partner caught 2 horse thieves. Horse stealing was no small crime. It could mean death. As Bull tried to hold them, one thief went for his pistol. Before anyone could blink, Bull fired his shotgun. The sound thundered through the cold mountain air. When the smoke cleared, one man lay still on the ground. Bull just stood there, calm, silent, unshaken. That night, the mining camp learned that John Bull was a man who would shoot first and survive later. After that, Bull drifted from one camp to another. He was a gambler, a miner, and sometimes a brawler. He lived in tents, drank cheap whiskey, and slept under the stars. But wherever he went, fights seemed to follow. By the time he reached Austin, Nevada, his fists were almost as famous as his gun. People said he could clear a saloon with a single punch. Others said he never smiled unless someone lost money at his table. In truth, John Bull lived for risk. He needed the rush, the thrill that came with danger. To him, every card game was a war. Every stare-down was a test, and every fight was a reminder that he was still alive. In the frontier towns, respect wasn't given. It was taken. You earned it with your courage, your skill, or your speed on the draw. John Bull had all three. He was no outlaw in the traditional sense. He didn't rob banks or trains. But he lived by his own rules, and that often made him a target. He fought men who were drunk, desperate, or simply bored. Sometimes he won with his fists, sometimes with his gun. Every time he walked away. Each scar was a story. Each victory, a warning. As the years passed, Bull's legend began to grow. Not because he was the fastest or the deadliest, but because he was still alive. Many men in the West met their end before they turned 30. John Bull was different. He seemed untouchable, yet deep down he knew the truth. Luck runs out. Bullets don't always miss. And every man has an enemy waiting somewhere. That enemy would appear in Helena, Montana, in the summer of 1867. His name was Langford Peel, known to gamblers as Farmer Peel, a man as proud and quick-tempered as Bull himself. They had once been friends, partners at the card tables. But money and pride were poison, and when pride takes hold in the West, it always ends the same way, with guns drawn at dawn. But before that fateful day arrived, Bull kept wandering, unaware that his biggest fight was yet to come. He played cards in smoky saloons, his one good eye always watching. He carried himself like a man who expected trouble and never feared it. To him, life was just a series of games. Some won, some lost, and in the flicker of oil lamps, surrounded by whiskey bottles and whispers, John Bull became something more than a gambler. He became a myth, a ghost who survived every gunfight, every ambush, every town that tried to bury him. People began to say he was cursed, or blessed, depending on who told the tale. A man who could not die. A name that would echo across the frontier for decades. But behind that legend was a truth few knew. John Bull wasn't fearless. He was just tired of running. He had crossed oceans and deserts, lived through gunfire and loneliness. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing peace, and never found it. Every town, every saloon, every pair of eyes watching him over a poker table reminded him of the same thing. In the West, death was patient. It waited for you to relax, to blink, to think you'd won, and for John Bull, that moment of reckoning was coming soon. He'd shot thieves. He'd fought drunks. He'd faced down men who wanted his blood. But in Helena, Montana, he'd meet someone who wouldn't back down. A friend turned rival, a duel that would define his name forever. The summer sun burned hot over Helena, Montana in 1867. The air was dry, the streets were dust, and the town buzzed with miners, gamblers, and dreamers chasing silver and gold. In one of the crowded saloons on Main Street sat John Bull, the English gambler with cold eyes and steady hands. Cards clicked, whiskey flowed, and money changed hands faster than a gun could fire. Across the table sat a man who once called him friend, Langford Farmer Peel, tall, proud, quick-tempered, a former soldier turned gambler. Two men with the same habits, the same hunger, and the same fire burning inside. That was the problem. In the Wild West, there's only room for one man with that kind of pride. They had once been partners. They'd played cards together, drank together, maybe even saved each other's lives. But time, money, and whiskey twist friendships into rivalries. Rumors had been circling Helena for weeks. Some said Bull cheated Peel in a game. Others said Peel called Bull a liar. No one knew the truth. But everyone knew it would end badly, and that night, it did. Inside the saloon, the game was tense. Stacks of gold coins sat between them. Sweat trickled down Bull's temple, though his hands never shook. Peel's eyes burned with anger. "Call," Bull said calmly. The crowd leaned closer. The cards hit the table, then Peel exploded. "You cheat, John! You think you can rob me in front of my own friends?" The room went silent. No one moved. Bull stared back, voice low and sharp. "I don't cheat, Peel, but I won't let you call me a liar." Peel's hand moved toward his holster. Bull's fingers twitched. Someone whispered, "Don't do it." But it was too late. Peel stormed out into the dusty street, shouting, "Come out, Bull! Let's settle this like men." Bull stood slowly. He finished his drink. Then he stepped outside. The street was empty but for the two of them. The late sun painted long shadows on the ground. Men peered from windows. Women pulled children inside, two gamblers, two guns. One moment of silence that felt like eternity. Peel shouted again, "Draw, you English dog!" Bull didn't answer. He looked at Peel, his old friend, his rival, his mirror. Then, lightning. Two gunshots cracked almost as one. Peel stumbled back, clutching his chest. Bull's pistol smoked in his hand. He took a slow step forward. Peel was still alive, gasping, trying to lift his gun again. Bull raised his weapon a second time and fired once more. Peel fell face first into the dust. The town watched in silence. John Bull holstered his revolver and turned away. Within minutes, the news spread. "Bull killed Peel! He shot him in cold blood. He had no choice." Everyone had an opinion. No one had the whole truth. The town marshal, ex-Bidler, a man known for taming chaos with a steady gun, arrested Bull before the mob reached him. Helena was ready to hang the Englishman that very night. A crowd gathered outside the jailhouse, ropes in hand, anger in their eyes. Bidler faced them down with a shotgun. "No man dies without a trial," he said. And the mob stepped back. Days later, the trial began. The courthouse was packed. Some said Bull was defending himself. Others said Peel never fired his gun. Witnesses argued, voices cracked, tempers flared. Bull sat quietly, eyes cold, hands folded. He didn't beg. He didn't explain. He simply said, "I did what I had to do." When the jury came back, the room held its breath. The verdict hung jury. Half thought he was guilty. Half thought he was justified. So the law let him go, but freedom came with a price. Helena never forgot that day. Some men avoided him. Others wanted revenge. Bull packed his few things and left town before sunrise. He never spoke of Peel again. He carried the weight of that day in silence, the look in his friend's eyes, the dust rising around his body, the echo of those 3 shots that never left his mind. As he rode out of Helena, the sky turned crimson behind him. The mountains swallowed his figure like a ghost disappearing into legend. He had killed his friend. He had beaten death again. But this time, something inside him changed. The West had a way of taking souls piece by piece. And for John Bull, That street in Helena was where he lost the last of his. From then on, he wasn't just a gambler or a gunman. He was a haunted man, hunted by memories, chased by guilt, and followed by whispers of his past. Everywhere he went, people knew his name. Some feared him, some admired him, but no one ever trusted him again. John Bull rode on, never staying long in one town. He would fight again, he would bleed again, and somehow, he would live again. When John Bull left Helena, Montana, he didn't look back. Behind him lay a grave, a ghost, and a story whispered in every saloon. He had killed his friend, Langford Peel, and though the law had set him free, the past followed like a shadow that never slept. The West had many towns, many roads, and John Bull walked them all. He drifted from Montana to Nevada, from Colorado to Wyoming, chasing luck and losing peace. No home, no family. Just cards, whiskey, and a revolver that never left his side. He would ride into a town at sunset, dusty hat, quiet eyes, a limp from an old wound. He'd head straight for the saloon, find a table, and deal himself into a game. Within hours, people would know his name. By dawn, someone would either fear him, envy him, or try to fight him. That was how life went for John Bull. Every town was a mirror of the last, bright lights, loud laughter, and the same darkness waiting behind it. He had money one night, none the next. He had friends one week, enemies the next, and through it all he carried that same cold calm, the kind that made men nervous even when he smiled. In Austin, Nevada, they said he broke a man's jaw with one punch. In Cheyenne, he supposedly outdrew a drunk deputy in less than a second. And in Denver, someone claimed he played poker for 3 straight days without sleep and walked away with everything on the table. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing distraction, the kind that came from danger, not comfort. Because when the night went quiet and the whiskey ran dry, the sound of that gunfight in Helena always came back. The flash, the scream, the silence. He couldn't drown it. He could only run from it. The years rolled on. The old mining camps began to die, replaced by railroads and new towns. But John Bull stayed the same, a man out of time, moving through the past even as the world changed around him. He became known as a gambler with a gun and a fighter with no fear. Men said you could shoot him and he'd just laugh it off, and maybe they weren't wrong. Because the truth was, he'd been shot more than once. In the early 1880s, in a smoky saloon somewhere in Wyoming, an argument broke out over a card game. Bull accused another gambler of hiding a card up his sleeve. The man drew first, firing wildly. One bullet hit Bull in the foot. He didn't fall. He didn't even cry out. He just leaned on the bar, reloaded, and shot the gun out of the man's hand. Then he said, "You can keep your winnings. You'll need 'em for the doctor." That story spread fast. People started calling him the Iron Gambler. They said he couldn't die. Not from bullets, not from luck, not from time. But luck is a strange thing. It gives, and it takes. In 1898, in Spokane, Washington, John Bull's luck finally cracked. Another gambler, drunk and angry, pulled a gun during a heated game. Shots rang out. Bull was hit, not once, but several times. One bullet tore through his arm, shattering the bone. Doctors couldn't save it. They took the arm off. For most men, that would have been the end. But John Bull wasn't most men. He lived, he healed, and soon he was back in the saloons, dealing cards with one hand and keeping a revolver close with the other. People watched him walk down the street and whispered, "There goes John Bull, the man who won't die." As the century turned, the Old West began to fade. The gunslingers were gone. The cowtowns turned quiet. But John Bull was still out there, older now, slower, but alive. Sometimes he'd sit by himself in a corner, lighting a cigar with shaking fingers. He didn't talk much. When people asked about the past, he'd just smile and say, "I've buried too many stories already." His eyes told the rest, eyes that had seen more death, more dust and more dawns than most men ever would. No one really knew how he survived it all, the bullets, the fights, the loneliness. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe John Bull just refused to give death the satisfaction. He'd say, half joking, "Death's been after me for years. He just can't find my address." But deep down he knew it wasn't over. The West had long memories, and so did its ghosts. And somewhere, out there on the endless trail, His story still had one last twist waiting. As he grew older, he moved from place to place, Idaho, Colorado, Oregon, never staying long enough to belong. He was a relic in a world that no longer needed men like him. The New West had telephones and trains, not gunfights and gambling halls. Yet every now and then, when trouble found him, and it always did, John Bull proved he still had that old fire. He'd stand his ground, eyes cold, voice steady, like a man who'd seen the end too many times to be afraid of it anymore. For decades, John Bull walked the border between life and death, never a hero, never a villain, just a man trying to outlive his past. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. By the dawn of the new century, the Old West was gone. The gunfights had quieted. The dusty saloons were turning into shops and hotels. The outlaws had become old men, their legends fading like smoke after a shot. But somewhere in that new world, one of the last gunmen still lived, John Bull, the English gambler who refused to die. He was no longer young. His hair had turned white, his body thin and tired. He moved slower now, leaning on a cane where once he had carried a gun. One arm was gone, lost years ago in Spokane after yet another shooting. But his eyes, they were still sharp, still watching, still ready. John Bull had outlived almost everyone he ever knew. Friends, enemies, rivals, all buried by time. He had no family, no wife, no home. Just the stories that followed him, whispered by men who never met him but swore they knew him. They said, "He's been shot more times than anyone alive." They said, "Death gave up on him." And they weren't far from the truth. In 1921, John Bull was living quietly in Excelsior Springs, Missouri. He was an old man now, in his mid-80s. He spent his days sitting on the porch of a small boarding house, smoking cigars and watching the world move on without him. But one morning, he woke up with a strange pain in his neck. A deep throbbing ache that wouldn't go away. The local doctor came to see him. He pressed gently on the side of Bull's neck and frowned. "What's this lump?" the doctor asked. Bull smiled faintly. "Could be a memory," he said, "or maybe a mistake that never left." The doctor sent him to the hospital. When they examined him under better light, they couldn't believe what they found. A bullet, a real lead bullet, buried deep in his neck. It had been there for nearly 50 years, no infection, no major damage, just there, resting beside the bones, a quiet reminder of the life he'd lived. When they told him, John Bull just chuckled. "Well," he said, "I always wondered why shaving hurt so damn much." The doctors decided to remove it. The operation was small, but the story made big news. Newspapers printed the headline, "Old Gunfighter Carries Bullet in Neck for Half a Century." People couldn't believe it. Some called it luck. Others called it stubbornness. But Bull just called it life. After the surgery, he kept the bullet. A small gray piece of metal, scarred, misshapen, cold. He carried it in his coat pocket, like a trophy from a long, violent past. Whenever someone asked about it, he'd grin and say, "That little thing tried to kill me once. Didn't do the job." It became his story's final symbol, proof that even when the West itself had died, its ghosts still walked among men like him. In those final years, Bull traveled north, crossing the border into Canada. He settled quietly in Vancouver, British Columbia, far from the dusty plains that had once echoed with his footsteps. There, no one knew him as a gunman. He was just an old Englishman with one arm, a limp, and a strange glint in his eye. He played cards with locals, told small stories, and laughed at jokes most people didn't understand. Sometimes at sunset, he'd walk along the waterfront and watch the ships fade into the horizon. And maybe, just for a moment, he'd remember the wide, endless deserts, the saloons, the gun smoke, the faces of men who'd come and gone. All gone now, except him. People often asked him how he'd managed to live so long. He'd shrug and say, "Maybe I just didn't have anywhere else to go." And that was the truth. He wasn't chasing life. He was just waiting for it to stop chasing him. In 1929, at around 93 years old, John Bull finally laid down his cards for good. He died quietly in his sleep, far from gunfire, far from danger, far from the world that had made him a legend. There were no headlines this time. No crowds, just a short note in a Vancouver paper. "John Bull, old-time gambler, passes away peacefully." No mention of the gunfights. No mention of the bullet. No mention of the life that read like a Western novel written by fate itself. But for those who knew his name, John Bull was something rare, a man who'd survived every rule of the West. He wasn't the fastest draw. He wasn't the richest gambler. He wasn't even the most famous. But he was the last of a breed, a living relic from a world that refused to let him go. He carried his scars like medals. He carried his silence like pride. And in the end, the bullet in his neck became more than metal. It became a symbol of what the West truly was, beautiful, brutal, and unforgettable. John Bull never wanted to be a legend. He just wanted to survive. But sometimes, survival itself becomes legend. And when the last gunsmoke faded and the last card fell, the man who wouldn't die finally did. But his story didn't end. It just rode off into the sunset. The year was 1929 and John Bull was gone. No gunfire marked his end. No crowd gathered in the street. No one whispered his name over whiskey in the saloon. He just slipped away. And just like that, the last echo of a wild age faded into silence. The newspapers called him an old-time gambler. That was all. Not a word about the gunfights, the blood, the narrow escapes, or the legend he carried. To the people of Vancouver, he was just another old man who'd outlived his time. But to those who knew the stories, the whispers, the rumors, the fragments of truth passed down from dusty saloons, John Bull was something else. He was proof that the West had once been real. A living reminder that behind every legend was a man, tired, scarred, and still standing. They say time buries everything. But time couldn't quite bury John Bull. In the old mining towns of Montana and Nevada, some still remembered. An old bartender in Helena would tell the tale, how Bull shot Farmer Peel right there in the street, cool as ice. A grizzled miner in Cheyenne might swear, "I saw him fight 3 men with 1 arm and still walk away." And a gambler in Denver might lean close and whisper, "That man had death in his shadow, and somehow death always missed." Over the years, stories of John Bull grew like the desert wind, twisting, shifting, half true, half myth. Some said he killed a dozen men. Others said he never killed anyone after Peel. No one could prove much. The records were thin, the witnesses long gone. But the myth, it refused to die, because every age needs its ghosts. And John Bull was one of the West's most enduring ghosts. In the decades that followed, writers and historians dug through the ashes of the Old West, trying to piece together the truth. They found names like Earp, Hickok, and Holiday, men whose stories became books and movies. But when they found John Bull, they paused. His story didn't fit the usual shape. He wasn't a lawman. He wasn't a famous outlaw. He didn't die young in a blaze of glory. He just survived, and that made him different. Too real, too complicated, too quiet to sell in the theaters. But those who looked closer saw something remarkable. John Bull's life was a mirror of the West itself. Wild, reckless, tragic, and stubbornly alive long after it should have been gone. He came from across the ocean, chasing fortune. He fought, he gambled, he lost friends, and buried his youth under the weight of his choices. He saw the world change, from horses to railroads, from saloons to cities. He outlived every man who once called him dangerous. And in the end, he proved that survival is sometimes more powerful than heroism. In the late 1900s, a few historians rediscovered him. Writers like Robert K. DeArmond, who included Bull in his book, Deadly Dozen Forgotten Gunfighters of the Old West. There, Bull's name returned, not as a forgotten shadow, but as one of the great survivors of America's most violent era. Readers were stunned. How had this man escaped fame? How had history forgotten the English gunman who'd lived through 100 deaths? The answer was simple. John Bull never chased fame. He never wrote his story. He didn't care if the world remembered him, only that it didn't bury him before he was ready, and that, in a strange way, became his greatest legacy. While others died young and glorious, Bull lived long and quietly. He proved that the real frontier wasn't just about drawing faster, it was about lasting longer. His story became a lesson that legends aren't always loud and survival isn't always clean. Sometimes the greatest story is the one that almost no one remembers. If you walk the streets of modern Helena, the saloon where Bull and Peel faced each other is long gone. The dust has been paved over, the echoes of their guns replaced by the hum of cars, But somewhere beneath those streets, under the layers of time, lies the memory of that day. A man standing calm while death stared him down, and another man falling to the earth in silence. It's all history now. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the whisper of boots on wood, the click of a revolver, the steady breath of a gambler who refused to flinch. That's John Bull, the man who wouldn't die, still walking somewhere between truth and legend. The Wild West gave us heroes and villains, but John Bull was neither. He was something rarer, a man who lived long enough to watch his own legend fade. Yet even in silence, his story speaks. It tells us that survival is its own kind of victory, and sometimes the quietest names echo the longest. He wasn't born in the West. He didn't grow up on the plains or ride wild horses as a boy. He came from across the ocean, from England, a world of fog, chimneys, and cobblestone streets, and yet, that Englishman, John Bull, became one of the hardest men the Wild West ever saw. But being an outsider came with a price. When John Bull first stepped onto American soil in the 1850s, he wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing freedom, a new start, a place where a man's past didn't matter, only his courage did. The frontier offered that promise. But it also offered danger. It was a place where strangers were tested, and foreigners were often distrusted. And John Bull, with his sharp accent and colder eyes, was as foreign as they came. In the mining camps of Montana, the name John Bull was almost a joke. It was an old slang term Americans used for an Englishman, half insult, half nickname. But he wore it like armor. If they wanted to call him John Bull, then John Bull he would be. The name became his shield and eventually his legend. He turned their mockery into myth. Because every time someone called him Bull, they remembered what happened next. The card games, the fights, the gunfire. And soon enough, the name wasn't funny anymore. It was feared. Still, that feeling of not belonging never left him. No matter how many towns he rode through, he was always the outsider. He didn't have family out west. He had no one to visit, no one to write home to, so he built his own kind of family, a rough circle of gamblers, drifters, and brawlers who lived by the same rule. Win if you can. Survive if you can't. They weren't heroes, but they understood each other. They were men who had burned their bridges long ago. And in that harsh brotherhood, John Bull found something like belonging. Temporary, dangerous, and fragile. But his English roots made him different from most men of the West. He was quieter, more deliberate. He didn't boast. He didn't brag about his kills or his fights. When others talked loud, he watched. When they drew first, he waited. That calm, controlled nature unnerved people. They couldn't read him. They couldn't predict him. And in a world of wild tempers, a man who didn't show his anger was a man to be feared. Never trust a quiet one, they'd whisper. Especially if he's got an accent. And yet, despite all the danger, Bull never truly belonged to the West or the East. He lived between worlds, too wild for England, too foreign for America. A wanderer with no home, no country, and no peace. Maybe that's why he fought so hard. Not for money, not for glory, but to prove, to himself if no one else, that he existed, that a man with no roots could still leave a mark in the dust. Years later, when people told stories of him, they always started the same way. You ever hear of that English gunfighter John Bull? And every version was different. In one story he was noble, a gentleman gambler who only killed in self-defense. In another, he was a ruthless drifter who left towns in flames. But no matter how they told it, they always said the same thing in the end. He just wouldn't die. That was the part everyone agreed on. In truth, John Bull was neither hero nor villain. He was something else, a mirror of the West itself. Hard, unforgiving, proud, and lonely. He lived by instinct. He trusted few. He loved danger more than comfort, because it was the only thing that ever felt real to him. And maybe that's why death could never find him. Because deep down, John Bull had already made peace with it. He carried death with him. In the scars, in the memories, in that bullet buried deep inside his neck. He didn't fear dying. He feared being forgotten. But history has a cruel way of forgetting men like him. He wasn't American-born, so his name didn't fit the tall tales of frontier folklore. He wasn't law or outlaw, just a survivor. And in a country that worshipped heroes and villains, there was no place for a man who was both. So slowly, over time, John Bull's name slipped through the cracks of memory. While others became legends, he became a rumor. A face in the smoke, a ghost in the saloon light, and yet, his story still lingers. Because every time someone digs into the forgotten corners of Western history, they find him, the Englishman who came to America with nothing, who fought fate with his bare hands, and who refused to die until time itself gave up trying. He came to the West to escape his past, but the West gave him a new one, the Englishman who became a gunfighter, the stranger who became a legend. And though the world forgot his name, the dust still remembers his footsteps. There's a strange kind of curse that comes with living too long. You stop fearing death and start fearing time. John Bull knew that curse better than anyone. He had survived the bullets, the brawls, and the blood. But now, in his old age, he faced an enemy he couldn't outdraw: loneliness. By the early 1900s, the West he once knew was gone. The dusty trails were paved. The gunfights were stories told to children. The sound of horses had been replaced by the hum of cars and the whistle of trains, and John Bull, the man who had once been part of the chaos, was left standing, alone in a world that no longer had room for men like him. He was a relic, walking through history like a ghost that time had forgotten to bury. He'd sit outside saloons that had turned into cafes, smoking a cigar with his one good hand, staring at the horizon. People would pass him by without knowing who he was. They'd see an old man with a missing arm and a quiet stare, never realizing he'd once faced death and won. Sometimes a younger man might sit beside him, curious about his scars. "Old-timer," they'd say, "you ever seen a gunfight?" And John Bull would smile, a tired half-smile that said more than words ever could. Once or twice he'd whisper. Then he'd go silent again, because how could they understand? The world he'd lived in was gone, replaced by one too clean, too quiet, too civilized. A world that had forgotten the smell of gunpowder and the sound of courage. He had outlived almost everyone. The gamblers, the gunmen, the sheriffs, the drifters, all dead and buried. Even the places he once called home had vanished. Helena, Austin, Cheyenne, they still existed, but not the way he remembered them. He was the last man of his kind. And that, more than any bullet, was what truly hurt. At night, he'd dream of the past, of the saloon lamps flickering in smoky air, of the sound of laughter mixed with fear, of Langford Peel's face in that dusty street in Helena, the moment before the first shot. No matter how many years passed, that memory stayed as sharp as the day it happened. Sometimes he'd wake in a cold sweat, clutching the side of his neck where the bullet had been. It wasn't pain he felt, it was the weight of time. A reminder that he'd lived long enough to remember too much. People began to call him a legend. But to John Bull, that word meant nothing. Legends were stories about other people, about brave heroes who died young, not about tired old men who couldn't die at all. He didn't see himself as brave. He saw himself as stubborn. He had never asked for glory, only for another sunrise. And somehow sunrise kept coming. As he grew older, he moved slower. His limp got worse. His eyesight dimmed, but his mind stayed sharp. Sharp enough to remember every face he'd seen fall, every shot he'd fired, every deal that had gone bad. He often said, "The hardest part of living long isn't dying, it's remembering." Because the truth was simple. The more he survived, the more ghosts followed him. And sometimes, late at night, he'd pour a drink and set a second glass beside it, for the men who didn't make it this far. In his final years, John Bull stopped gambling. Not because he lost his love for the game, but because he'd realized life itself had been the longest gamble of all. He'd won the only prize that mattered, time. But even that victory came with a cost. He often sat alone in the quiet, staring into the distance as if expecting someone to appear. But no one ever did. The friends he had once laughed with were long gone. The enemies who had tried to kill him were long buried. And the world had moved on without him. One afternoon, a local reporter in Missouri visited him for an interview. They'd heard about the old man who carried a bullet in his neck for 50 years. The reporter asked him, "Mr. Bull, do you ever feel lucky to have lived this long?" Bull laughed softly. "Lucky?" he said. "I don't know about lucky. I just kept waking up." Then he leaned back, took a drag of his cigar, and added, "Outliving your enemies feels good. Outliving your friends, that's the hard part." That one line stayed with the reporter for years. It was the truest thing anyone had ever said about the frontier. The one lesson that no book or legend could capture, because in the end, the West wasn't about who shot fastest. It was about who could endure, who could face the emptiness that came after the dust settled. And no one embodied that better than John Bull. He had been the young gambler who drew first, the fighter who couldn't lose, the man with the bullet that refused to kill him. And now he was something else entirely, the man who lived too long. John Bull beat death 100 times, but he couldn't beat time. He saw the world change, the people fade, the West turn to memory. And in the end, his greatest victory was also his greatest sorrow. He lived long enough to watch it all disappear. Time has a way of choosing its heroes. It keeps some names alive forever and lets others disappear into dust. And for a long time, John Bull was one of the forgotten ones. When he died in 1929, the world barely noticed. There were no headlines, no ballads, no statues. Just a small note in a quiet newspaper that read, "John Bull, an old-time gambler, passed away peacefully." And just like that, a man who had survived 100 gunfights vanished from history. For decades, no one spoke his name. The Old West had already become a story, polished, romantic, and full of clean heroes and clear villains. But John Bull didn't fit that story. He wasn't a marshal. He wasn't an outlaw. He was something harder to define. A man who lived by his own rules and answered to no one. And in the world of legends, there's little room for truth. While names like Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, and Wild Bill Hickok filled books and movie screens, John Bull's story faded into silence. Even the men who had once known him were gone. Their memories died with them, leaving only fragments, half-remembered tales told by old drifters in bars that no longer stood. Soon, even those whispers faded too. For nearly half a century, John Bull was nothing more than a ghost, a name written in the margins of old newspapers, a rumor passed around by historians who weren't sure he was real. But time, like the desert wind, has a strange way of circling back. In the 1970s, a handful of Western historians began digging through forgotten archives and faded wanted posters. They were searching for the men who had slipped through the cracks, the ones who hadn't made it into the Hollywood version of the West. And there, buried among old records and yellowed letters, they found him, John Bull, a name scribbled in trial notes, a witness statement from Helena, Montana, 1867, a coroner's report, a newspaper headline, "Langford Peel shot dead in the street." Piece by piece, the fragments came together. And what they uncovered was something remarkable. A man who had lived through the most violent years of the American frontier, and lived to tell about it. In Robert K. Dearmont's book, Deadly Dozen Forgotten Gunfighters of the Old West, John Bull's name appeared once more, not as myth, but as fact. Dearmont called him a man of violence and endurance, one who had walked through death and come out the other side. Readers were stunned. They had never heard of him. How could a man who had fought duels, killed in cold blood, and carried a bullet in his neck for 50 years be so completely forgotten? The answer was simple. John Bull didn't tell his own story. He lived it, but he never tried to sell it. Unlike other gunfighters, Bull didn't seek fame or fear. He never gave interviews. He never bragged about his kills. He didn't want to be a legend. He wanted to be left alone, and because of that silence, history almost erased him. But maybe that's exactly what he wanted. Maybe the man who had spent his whole life escaping death just wanted to escape memory too. Still, when people read about him again, about the Englishman who came to the wildest land on earth and somehow outlived it, something stirred. They felt a strange kind of admiration. He wasn't the fastest or the flashiest, but he was real. He didn't play to the crowd or pose for the camera. He simply endured, and that endurance became his legend. Today, historians call John Bull one of the last true gunfighters, a bridge between two worlds, the savage frontier of the 1800s and the modern age that buried it. He didn't die young like the heroes of dime novels. He lived long enough to see the myth of the West replace the truth. He lived long enough to become invisible. But invisibility was its own kind of freedom, because in being forgotten, he became something even rarer, a man untouched by the lies of legend. If you walk through an old Western museum today, you might find his name on a single plaque or mentioned in a quiet corner of a book. But if you listen closely, behind all the famous names and romantic tales, there's something different about his story. It's not about fame. It's not about victory. It's about survival. Raw, lonely, and defiant. John Bull didn't live to be remembered. He lived because he refused to die. And in the end, that might be the truest story the West ever told. History forgot his name, but time couldn't erase his story. The Englishman who faced the gun, the mob, and the years, and walked away from them all. Every man who lived by the gun had a code, a set of rules written not on paper, but in scars. For John Bull, that code was simple. It wasn't about honor. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West. He wasn't the deadliest or the most famous. But he was the most patient. And patience, in the Wild West, was deadlier than speed. He never drew first unless he had to. He never picked fights he couldn't finish. He watched, waited, and learned. While others shouted, John Bull stayed quiet. While others reached for their pistols, he reached for understanding. He studied men like a gambler studies cards. Every movement, every twitch, every breath. And when the time came to act, he didn't hesitate. That was his first rule. Don't act fast. Act right. The second rule was even simpler. Trust no one, not completely. He had learned that the hard way. Langford Farmer Peel had been his friend once. They'd laughed together, gambled together, and one day they'd faced each other in the street. After that, John Bull never trusted a smile that came too easily. He never believed a hand that offered friendship without a reason. Because in the West, betrayal didn't come with warning. It came with a gunshot. His third rule was born from years of fighting and fleeing. Never stay too long in one place. He moved from town to town, always one step ahead of his past. He knew that stories followed faster than men. And when stories reached the wrong ears, trouble wasn't far behind. So he kept riding. Helena to Cheyenne, Denver to Spokane, a trail of dust and half-remembered faces behind him. If he made friends, he didn't keep them. If he made enemies, he didn't fear them. He just kept moving. That's how you survived the West. Not by standing your ground, but by knowing when to ride away. But the fourth rule, the one that truly defined him, was this: always look death in the eye. Most men feared dying. John Bull didn't. He'd seen it too often to fear it anymore. To him, death was like an old rival, a familiar face that showed up at the table from time to time, and like any good gambler, he treated it with respect. He never bragged about surviving. He never dared fate to try again. He just nodded to it and played his hand carefully. Maybe that's why he lived so long. He never ran from death. He simply outwitted it. The men who watched him often said, "There's something strange about Bull. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't blink. It's like he already knows what's coming." And maybe he did. Because John Bull had learned the oldest truth of the frontier. Life isn't about winning every fight. It's about walking away from the last one. When he lost his arm in Spokane, he didn't curse his luck. He laughed. "Guess I've still got one hand left," he said. Then he lit a cigar and carried on like nothing had changed. He played cards with his remaining hand, shot with it, drank with it, and never once asked for pity. To him, losing a limb wasn't tragedy. It was just another rule of the game. You play the hand you're dealt, even when the cards are bad. That was the gambler's code. That was John Bull's life. He also believed in one more rule, one few men of his time understood: keep your temper cold. He knew that anger was the fastest way to die. In a world full of loud tempers and quick hands, it was the quiet men who lived longest. He never raised his voice. He never shouted. Even in his gunfights, he was calm, frighteningly calm. When he shot Peel, witnesses said he looked almost sad. Not proud, not angry, just sad. As if he knew every bullet carried a piece of his own soul. Over time, those rules became who he was. They shaped every choice, every scar, every survival. He didn't write them down. He didn't preach them. But anyone who met him could feel them. A quiet code written into his eyes. And that code, more than his gun or his luck, was what kept him alive for over 90 years. When historians rediscovered his story decades later, they called him a survivor. But survival isn't luck. It's discipline. It's instinct. It's knowing when to fight, when to run, and when to let go. And John Bull mastered that art better than anyone. Maybe that's why, when the bullet was finally pulled from his neck in 1921, he laughed. He wasn't laughing at the doctors. He was laughing at death itself, as if to say, you had your chance, and you missed. John Bull's code wasn't written in words. It was carved into his life. Don't act fast. Act right. Trust no one. Move often. Keep your temper. And when death comes, look it in the eye. That was how one man lived through the deadliest age in American history and came out breathing. The wind over the frontier had gone quiet. The saloons were empty. The gun smoke had drifted away for good. But somewhere beyond that silence, in the fading light of history, one story still breathed. The story of John Bull, the gambler who lived longer than the West itself. He came from another world, an Englishman who crossed the ocean with nothing but his courage and his cards. He found a land full of danger, greed, and dreams. He didn't conquer it. He didn't tame it. He simply survived it. While others died young and famous, John Bull lived old and forgotten. And maybe that was his secret victory, to walk through a world built on death and keep walking when everyone else was gone. When people speak of the Wild West, they talk about heroes and villains. The sheriff and the outlaw, the lawman and the killer. But John Bull was neither. He was the man in the middle, too proud to kneel, too stubborn to quit, too human to be a myth. He didn't fight for justice. He didn't fight for revenge. He fought for one thing only, to see the next sunrise. And maybe that's what made him truly great. Because life in the Old West wasn't about winning every fight. It was about lasting through the night. It was about staring into the eyes of fear and refusing to blink. It was about men like John Bull who didn't ask for glory, but earned a kind of immortality just by refusing to fall. When he finally died in 1929, he was 93 years old, a man who had faced more bullets than birthdays. He died quietly, without witnesses or headlines. No final gunfight, no famous last words, just peace, something he'd been chasing his whole life. But death didn't erase him. It only gave his story a new shape. Because somewhere, deep in the bones of the West, in the dust of old trails, in the broken walls of forgotten saloons, the spirit of John Bull still lingers. The survivor. The fighter. The man who wouldn't die. Every now and then, a traveler might stop in some small Montana town and hear an old man say, "You ever hear of John Bull?" And maybe they'll tell the story of the English gunman who killed his friend, who lost his arm, who carried a bullet in his neck for 50 years, and still managed to outlive the very age that made him. And as they tell it, the firelight will flicker. And for a moment, just a moment, you'll feel like the Old West never really died, because legends never do. John Bull's life wasn't perfect. It was rough, violent, and lonely, but there was a strange beauty in it, a kind of poetry born from pain and endurance. He taught the world something few men ever could, that courage isn't loud. It doesn't ride in with guns blazing. Sometimes, courage is quiet, an old man lighting a cigar after another night he wasn't supposed to see. He lived by a code no one taught him, a code written in survival, loss, and pride. He never asked for mercy, and he never gave it. But in his own way, he was honest. Honest about life, honest about death, and honest about the thin line that separates the two. That honesty, more than his gun, more than his luck, made him a legend. As the decades rolled by, his name drifted through history like a whisper. Some forgot it, some doubted it ever existed. But the West remembered. The land always remembers, because it was built by men like him. Foreigners, dreamers, drifters, survivors. Men who came with nothing but courage, and left behind stories that refuse to die. If you stand on an old dirt road at dusk and the wind blows just right, you might almost hear it. The click of cards, the soft scrape of a revolver, and a low, steady voice saying, "Don't act fast. Act right." That's John Bull, the last echo of a world long gone. The man who lived too long. The man who outlasted death. The man time almost forgot, but never could. John Bull's story is not about glory, it's about grit. It's about what it means to keep standing when the world moves on without you. The English gunman who outlived the Wild West proved one simple truth. You don't have to be famous to be legendary. You just have to keep breathing when everyone else stops. If this story moved you, share it, because some legends only live when we remember them.